also come in. Paul C. couldn't be with us today because he has a sick child. I'm hoping that we will see, and if we don't see, that you all will be in touch with Daniel Bradley. Come. Last night? Did he say he was coming? Oh, yeah. Well, just continue to remember Daniel in your prayers, because we love him. I have asked Ray if he'll tell his call story today as we get started and say our opening prayer.
It's an honor to get to tell how God worked in your life. And I got to admit that a good bit of this is going to be confession this morning, but hey, we're getting ready to go into Ash Wednesday, right? So October 14th, 1972, I was born on a pew of a United Methodist church, I'm pretty sure. Not really, but I think church has always been a part of my life. My dad was a pastor, is a pastor, and was when I was born, is now. And so I grew up really loving the church, and it's where I met some of the best people that I've ever known in my life, and people that have influenced me and impacted me and loved me through every stage of life so far. And growing up as a preacher's kid, I loved being a preacher's kid. And my brothers and sisters, they might feel differently, but I absolutely loved everything about it. I even loved it when we got to move from time to time, because it was kind of a starting over thing for me. And we didn't move a whole lot, but through all those years, Mom and Dad never sheltered me from the ups and downs of ministry, and I experienced it right there with them. And I think last time we were here, we were talking about, we're up here, and there was a chair and the connection, and that really moved in my heart, because I felt like the three of us, at least, and with my younger siblings, we were all kind of partners in that together. And that being said, kind of felt early on God's calling on my life, but it's something I didn't want to do. I love being a preacher's kid, but I didn't want to be a preacher. I used to have to literally go throw up before I would do a narration for an Easter cantata, which I always got picked to do. I'd get so nervous and so scared to do that, but I just kind of always felt that tug on my heart to do it. And so this is part of the confession. And Robert Karaoke, this does not leave this room. Okay. I was a youth delegate to annual conference one year, and a bunch of us were walking from Sunnyside Terrace to the Stewart Auditorium, and it was raining, and I had a crush on Suki at your church. Oh, I met her that week, and my heart was just, and so it was raining, and she was carrying an umbrella, and I was under that with her, and we were friends, and that's, she was way out of my league. So that stays right here, and I remember. Oh, okay, well. What's out is out. Anyway, that night, I remember feeling, walking towards that in the rain. The cross was up on the hill. I need you to do this with your life. And I remember then, because I was probably a senior in high school, bargaining with God. Let me go to college, and then I'll come back to this, because I'm going to need to go to college anyway. So I justified that, and I went to ETSU and thought that calling would go away, and it didn't. When I got out of college, I remember making the same bargaining with God. Let me work a little while in what I went to college for, and then I'll circle back to it. My dream was to have my own ad agency, and that was my degree in marketing, communications, public relations, and I love that. And I thought that's going to get me farther and farther away from my calling, and it did for a while. It opened up some opportunities for me to get some life experience, working for newspapers and magazines and kind of doing my own thing from time to time, and I absolutely loved that. And I thought, this is where I'm going to be. But I didn't realize that God was using all of that experience and all of that time and all of those things to just get me right where he needed me to be at the right moment, because I wasn't spiritually mature enough coming out of college to even think about serving a church. And then when I was about 30 and having 10 years of that kind of experience, and I just being right where I thought that I wanted to be, but there was still this emptiness in my life that I couldn't understand, and I couldn't really put into words. And it was like God put me in the belly of a whale, getting me where he needed me to go against my will. And I thought, I'm going to give it a shot and just see if that's what is missing in my life. And I remember telling my dad that I felt like I might be called to preach. And for about 2 years, he tried his best to talk me out of it and discourage. To the point where I loved my dad, but I was really, I thought you'd be more supportive. I thought you'd be more excited. And I kept at it. And I wrote a sermon one time, and he let me preach on a Sunday night at Kingsley United Methodist Church. And I always had a good crowd on Sunday nights, and I had 12 pages of notes, and I preached that sermon in about 4 minutes because I was so nervous and scared. And I remember after that, I thought, well, okay, maybe Dad was right. He said, son, I think you got it. And he coached me and worked with me, and still today does that and mentors me. And after my ordination, I said, you remember when you tried to talk me out of this? And he said, yes. And I don't apologize for it, because if I could have talked you out of it, then your calling wouldn't have been real. And that changed everything for me. And I love being a pastor. I love the ups and downs that it brings, and the challenging times where you feel God just refining you and preparing you and opening your heart to new things and new people and new opportunities. And when you surrender yourself completely to him, that was what was missing in those 10 years of my life, that I didn't understand what God was doing or how he was preparing me to do the work that he's called me to do. And now, 20 years into this, and I'm not looking back. I wouldn't do anything different. And I'm grateful for every moment and every opportunity, and every Sunday I get to stand in a pulpit somewhere, because I get to live out my passion with the people that I love the most every Sunday. So that's my call story. Don't have some big conversion. Jack Edwards told me sometime, he said, I thought my call story was kind of boring, and my story of faith was kind of boring. He said, it's a story of consistency, and there's something to that. So you may be like me. You don't have that big Damascus Road conversion, but you've always just kind of been connected to God in a real intimate way, and I'm grateful for that too. Oh, well, yeah. Part of my enjoying life in my 20s, I thought I really wanted to be the next Jeff Gordon. I've got a picture of in the newspaper where I'm standing in front of a race car with big poofy hair and big nose. I kind of looked the part. I did look like, if I'm even kind of standing on one leg. I'll have to bring that. But I thought I wanted to do that, and it was just a lot of fun. I got to go to racing school at Charlotte and Bristol, and raced at Coburn and Bulls Gap and Kingsport Speedway, and didn't do very well, but it was a short-lived career, but got that out of my system early to my mother's delight. So that's my confession and my call. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you call us different ways and different times in our life, that you never give up on us. Even when we try to run away from you, you pursue us with your grace and with your love and with your mercy. And Lord, as we begin this day, I'm thankful for my colleagues here and those that can't be with us for different reasons. I ask that you just pour out your Spirit on us and bless us. And Lord, I thank you for the work and the ministry that Tim Jones does in our conference communications office. And I just ask that you continue to make him fruitful and make their efforts fruitful in helping us to proclaim the good news to the world. We thank you for the message of hope that you give us to share. And Lord, just fill us with your peace this morning in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Well, good morning. When we agreed to come up here, I didn't know that we had the all-star lineup of pastors. This is a great group. I know many of you, looking forward to meeting a couple of you, but we're glad to be here. What we'll do is introduce ourselves and then go around the room, just so if I don't know you and if Ben doesn't know you, we can learn each other's names that we won't remember whatsoever. But you know, it's a fun little thing that everyone likes to do, right? Ray, I appreciate the prayer and I appreciate the blessing over the ministry, but you all are about to meet the rock star of the communications ministry. And when he gets up here to present, you'll recognize that very quickly. But I'll let Ben introduce himself, then we'll go around the room, and then I will introduce myself and get going. When it gets to you all, if you will tell us your name, where you're serving, and if you were going to take vacation tomorrow, where is the place you would love to be?
All right. My name is Ben Smith. I've met a couple of you, but many of you I don't know. I've been on staff at the conference office for almost a year. April 1 of last year is when I started. Prior to that, I contracted with the conference and did some work there. Before that, I worked for a production company doing communications and media production for some large corporations, small businesses, some nonprofits, all kinds of work like that. Before that, I was on staff full-time at Concord United in Knoxville. So lifelong Methodist, grew up attending Fountain City United Methodist in Knoxville as well, and then started in youth ministry and then in communications at Concord. So my background through school is communications and journalism, so I have some background there as well. Let's see, your question was vacation destination?
Yeah.
I just got back from a couple weeks ago from a cruise to Cozumel, Mexico and back, which was a lot of fun. And I went from, we drove from Knoxville to New Orleans and departed from New Orleans. And so Knoxville was like 35 degrees or something. And then the time we were in Cozumel was like 78, 79, sunny, beautiful. And then I come back and it's 30 degrees again in Knoxville. So it's that was really nice. I'm planning, this sounds like I'm a world traveler. I'm really not. We're planning a family trip to Morocco this summer, which I'm super excited about. So Morocco is on my mind right now. That would be my destination. So I'll be back up in a bit after Tim gets through his opening part. If we're gonna go around the room, maybe we'll start here and move kind of clockwise.
Yeah, so I'm Scott Spence. I'm the pastor here at Reynolds, but I'm also pastor in our Bristol Hope Parish model at John Wesley and Trinity and Hunt Memorial. Vacation spot. I'm going to tell a story because I can't make something up, my wife is here with me. She knows this. And so, we had a not-so-newlywed game here at the church, between our churches, doing a fundraiser for our Kenyan mission trip. And Pastor Robert, who's one of my great colleagues and a dear friend, he and his wife Agnes were part of that group. I was the MC, but I was actually, I love Agnes. I was roasting Robert. I was letting him have it. And so one of the questions was asked, if you could pick any all-expense-paid vacation, where would you go around the world? I am not going to tell you what Robert said. I'm going to allow him to tell you what he said. Yeah. No. You got to say it. You got to say it because you got to hear it coming from him. So, no, I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to let him say it. So my wife and I laughed. We've laughed about it for days ever since. So she asked me. So I asked her. I said, "What would have been your answer?" And she said, "Well, I know what you would want to go. I was born and raised on a family farm. It is my foundation. I know this is so simple. But if you ask me where I could go and spend a week where I could truly enjoy every moment of it, it would be on that family farm."
And I think that is why you say US right now is Morocco. I was like, we've gone, I was born in Africa, in Kenya. I met my wife here, but she's also from there. So we travel really. So while that question came to me, I was like, where does this girl want to go? And the best answer was, let's go to Walmart.
I love it. I love it.
Every time I pass a Walmart now, I think,
It's the luxurious things in life that we all long
Yep.
for.
Yep.
so funny.
That just kind of got me going all kinds of ways.
So you go to Walmart
I'm
now?
gonna walk right through. Well, the simplest things in life. At that point, I pastored Cedar Bluff and Clearview in Cedar Bluff, Virginia. Where would I would say Paris. Always just I'm going to Hawaii in a few months. But that's not a dream trip, but Paris would be a dream trip.
Okay.
I'm going to Hawaii and I'm going to Jamaica
Wow.
in another 2 months.
All right.
I'm going with you. You didn't know that, but
you
I'm
go.
going with you.
Well, Tim just got back from Paris
I
a
did.
month ago.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I am Robert Karaoke, pastoring John Wesley and Trinity. I'm also part of the Bristol Parish where we work together with Sister Caroline, Brother Scout, and Brother John who is not with us. Yeah, my wife wants to go to Jamaica, that's what she said, so maybe I'll hook her.
Great makeup, Mary. Great makeup.
As well as Walmart,
Yeah.
obviously. All right.
I'm Caroline Hawthorne, and I serve with Scott and Robert in the Bristol Parish. And I'm appointed at Hunt, but I serve Reynolds, John Wesley, and Trinity with them. And I oversee the Proverbs 3:27 mission, which is our homeless ministry here in Bristol. And I always wanted to go to Africa, but I went there last year, so it was like a dream come true. And I'm going back this year. So I guess my next dream would be to go to Australia.
Lisa Bryant, and I serve in the Asbury Keywood Cooperative Parish in Saltville, Meadowview, Chilhowie, that area. I love Paris, I love Hawaii. I would like to go to Greece.
Ooh.
Daniel Garrett, I'm Glade Spring Charge, which is Byers, Cobbs, and Glade, and Lebanon, and Meadowview, Virginia. If I'd go anywhere, it'd be a golf course in Scotland.
Ooh.
Oh.
Yeah.
I'd go to Scotland and play golf.
The home of golf. Yep. Yep.
My dream.
Glenn Patterson, I serve at Abingdon, Paul C. I have always thought that my happy place might be somewhere in New Zealand. It's beautiful there, and
Very nice.
Yeah. And it was in a all-you-can-eat seafood.
Yeah.
She's paying. Yeah, she's paying for what? Oh, she's paying for it.
My name is James Bennington. I'm the pastor at First Marion in Marion, Virginia. My wife and I have talked a lot about going to England and Scotland. I'd like to go back to Israel. I like, but really kind of a great place for us and a lot of fun and just real relaxing has been the beach. Near water and get a lot of perspective when you're near the water. See the ocean. It's a good, you can't help but relax when you're at the beach. Stress and beach don't go together.
I like it.
David Fugit, I serve East Marion Circuit, which is about Cromwell, Marion, Virginia, and Davis Memorial in Akron, Virginia. The beach is my happy place. So any beach.
All right, District Superintendent, you got to participate too.
I'm Jane Taylor. I'm the district superintendent here at Clinch Mountain District, and I would love to go to Israel.
Have you been before? Okay. And now the most important person in the room,
Yes,
Diane.
My name's Diane Spence. I'm Scott's wife. And this is really going to blow his mind, but if I had to pick, it would be a floating hotel in Bora Bora.
Wow. That's pretty specific. You could just take note of that real quick. Yeah.
30+ years, I'm taking mental note already.
If I was to ask my wife, she would say the exact same thing. And if you need to know pricing and how long you got to save up for that, let me know, because I'm looking at about another 15 years before we can even come close to it.
Thanks, Tim.
Absolutely.
That gives me some time.
There you go. There you go. I was just trying to set the bar for you. Well, I'm Tim Jones. I'm the Director of Communications at the Holston Conference. I've been in that role going on, entering into my 5th year. I'm also pastor in the conference. I've served churches in Powell, United Methodist, Peck's Memorial UMC, and Sycamore Tree UMC before coming into this role. Prior to coming into the United Methodist, I was ordained pastor in the Church of the Nazarene and spent time in the East Tennessee area and South Carolina area. And then I saw the light and jumped over to the UMC, and it was the best decision that I've ever made. And just found a home very quickly and absolutely love the United Methodist Church. Today, we're going to give you a high-level overview of communications, and then we're going to begin breaking things down. And there'll be different sections that we'll go over. We'll talk about social media. We'll talk about online presence just as a whole. We'll talk about email marketing, which is a big thing. We're going to talk about some rules, some regulations, some things to pay attention to, and open up for questions. And we'll also do a little piece on crisis communication. During this, I think I speak for Ben too. Neither one of us are very formal. So anytime there's a question, just interrupt and ask away. and we'll get started. So the first thing I want to talk about are, before you do any type of communication, there are a set of questions to think about. And they're the questions that you think about on anything when you're preparing sermons or whatever it may be. And it's the what, why, to whom, when, and how. And if you begin to notice something in the presentation, you're going to find a phrase. And I'll let you figure that out as we go through. But there's a phrase in there that is intentionally in there when it comes to these questions. And you don't always have to start with a particular area. You may start in the middle here and figure out, I want to send a communication out to a certain group or to certain people. And so you start there, and then you can work your way throughout the questions. But it's very important when you begin to think through communications to really set it up and think about these 5 questions, because if you don't, what happens is you begin to get in a rut, or you begin to send things out and you're beginning to send too many communications and people will begin to ignore you, or you send out communications that all look and sound the same, and then again people will begin to ignore you. And when we get to email, we'll talk about the frustration. Because I imagine there's never been a time in your pastoral career where someone hasn't come up to you on an event that has been publicized for every day for 4 years, and they say, I didn't know this was happening. Or why didn't you talk about, or why didn't you tell? And so some of this is to try to help us move beyond that. But I can tell you, no matter how many times you say it, no matter how many times you send it, there are still going to be people that don't get the message. But we'll work through that. So let's start with the first one. Let's start with these questions. If you got a piece of paper, I want you to give me a scenario of something that you would communicate at your church. So hit the 5 questions. So what's an example of something that you would communicate, whether it's an event coming up, whether it's a message coming up, a series, whatever it may be. Pick something that you want to communicate and write that down. Tell me your why. Why is it important that you're communicating whatever this is? Who you're communicating to, when will you begin the communications, and how often, and how will you communicate this message as far as what type of medium, how are you going to use the different styles of communication to put this out. And I'll give you just a couple of minutes, and then we'll hit a few of these. And we'll do this throughout the presentation. And there's the questions. Sorry. And while you're doing this, I do want to say I appreciate the fact that you all meet doing this leadership cohort. This is an incredible program that your district superintendent has put together. And I'm also, I was kind of blown away that you all meet monthly, correct? And it was really surprising that you meet for 12 hours. And I was really surprised. I thought, golly, I'm going to be talking a whole lot. But wouldn't be the first time. All right, let's get some examples going. David, What's something that you would communicate? Ash Wednesday service, all right. Why is it important for you to communicate it? Okay. Just out of curiosity, did anyone else choose Ash Wednesday? Okay. Lisa, anyone else? All right, I'll hop over to you, Lisa. Who's your audience, target audience?
Members of the different church as well as community.
Okay. All right. When will you begin communicating this and how often?
We put out a monthly calendar, and it goes out the last Sunday of previous month and the first Sunday of that month. So that's the first thing. It's on the calendar that goes out. And then announcements in the bulletin. Oh, I didn't put Facebook on there. Facebook, and then an email.
Okay.
Probably last week. Well, I sent one last week and yesterday.
Okay, great. And you've already answered how you'll communicate. No, that's fine. That's fine. That's perfect. Let me ask a question. Is there anyone in the room that has someone that you kind of turn communications over to? They're the ones that will either send your emails or do your social media if you have social media, or is that something that you all do yourselves? Yeah, yeah. Combination of both?
The majority, we have two actually, but then I also work in that as well. But
Gotcha.
For the most part, 90% of the time, actually, we have people that are conveying the message.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, so we have a mix of everything. One of the things that I would recommend is whether you're solo doing it or whether you have a team, that you set down, and Ben's going to really talk about this a little bit later on, and kind of put a calendar together. That way, it's not one of those things, even though Christmas is December 25th every year it seems to pop up on us. And it's like, oh my goodness, Christmas is next week. And I'm being facetious with that, but there are other things throughout that if we're not paying attention to in the life of a pastor, we get so busy that it's just there upon us. And not only that, but we also deal with the communication of the day, right? There's a very good possibility that sometime within the next 10 to 15 weeks, you're going to wake up on Sunday morning and something major within the world is going to have taken place. Last week and even yesterday, I believe, we had the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And that would be something that if you're getting ready to go into the pulpit on Sunday, knowing that, it may be something that you want to communicate. So we have, as pastors, we have communications that can be scheduled and should be scheduled, because if we don't schedule them, they can get lost sometimes in the present and in the chaos that will grab our attention. And just because chaos grabs our attention doesn't mean these other things shouldn't be communicated. It just means that our attention is focused on somewhere else. So when we go into our questions, what is the most important question you're going to ask? We begin with, what is communications? Not rhetorical. You can answer that. What is communications? Conveying information, getting out the word. What else? Pardon? Informing. Setting a tone. What else? Announcing.
Could be a reminder.
Reminder. What is it?
Warning.
Yes. What else? Think of how you communicate. What is communications for you as within your position? Talking, okay. Influencing. Sharing vision.
Being decisive.
Decision making, yes, being decisive. Yes.
Are we talking about the media or the purpose?
Yes. Yes. The reason I ask the question is because communications really encompasses everything. Everything that we do, there's some type of communication that goes about and surrounds us. In fact, some would argue, some theologians do argue, that communication is the greatest gift that God granted to humanity. Makes sense if you kind of think about it, because out of all of the creation, humanity has the ability to communicate more in depth and further than any other portion of creation, at least that we know of. And so we can have this interaction, which is communication. We can have relationships, which is communication. Think about, as a Gen Xer, we were told that our generation is all about deconstruction. We were the deconstructionists. So let's think about that for just a moment. What would the world be? What would your church be? What would your ministry be if you didn't have communication? Non-existent. There's no function. Absolutely no function without communication. And yet, communication is often the thing that is last on our agenda. Everything else comes forward, and then it's like, oh yeah, how are we going to get this word out? Or what are we going to do with it? But without it, nothing would function. And so you begin to understand communication influences everything. Let's ask the question, what's a strategy? Just in general, not necessarily communication strategy, but what's strategy in general? Plan. That's the simplest term for it, a plan. And so if you were to put the two together, what would be a communication strategy?
Sharing your plan.
Okay, both. Yeah. Sharing your plan and a plan to get the communication or the whatever you're viewing as communication to begin to line it up. So the next question, so if you've got communications and you understand that, and you understand that having a strategy is only going to make communications better, then you begin to ask the question, what am I trying to communicate? And so from each person, I'll just go around the room. When I say, what are you wanting to communicate Sunday? Give me just a few words. Scott.
So it would be our order of service. It would be upcoming.
Just few.
Okay.
Order of service. What do you want to communicate Sunday? Pass. Good answer.
Welcome to the desert.
Welcome to the desert. Not the jungle.
No.
Grace.
God's love.
God's love.
Faith.
Faith. A journey through Lent. Sorry, I'm sorry. United Methodist. Blessed are you. Grace. Grace. What's your plan to do it? That is rhetorical. Have you thought about, today being Tuesday, have you thought about how I'm going to communicate it? Not have you written your sermon, not have you done the bulletin, but have you thought about that thing that you're wanting to communicate? How am I going to do that? All right. So the other thing to think about when it comes to the what, once you decide what you're communicating and what your strategy is, then you begin to ask the question, what's your options? What are the options that I have when it comes to communicating? And we're going to get to that in a little bit. Statement, one of the statement of the day that I hope that you can walk out of here, if you don't remember anything, these statements that I have that'll pop up is what I want you to remember. What we communicate helps define who we are. Thanks, Ben. So who do you want to be? And I say that because whether you're talking about the folks in your congregation or whether you're talking about the community, whatever it is you're communicating defines what people think about you. Now, we all know that pastors communicate by preaching. We know they communicate by praying. We know they communicate by having a relationship and talking. But there's other things and other ways that we communicate as well, whether that's social media, whether that's email, whether that's some type of advertising. And I want us to think about that for just a minute. If we're sending emails out to the community or ads to the newspaper or radio or TV or whatever it may be, if we're posting on social media and people aren't 100% connected to our church, which I don't know if that is a thing anymore, what message are they hearing? Are they only hearing a communicated message of this is the next event that's taking place? Or are they only hearing about the next season that's coming up? Or are they hearing messages that go back to that message you told me that you wanted to communicate on Sunday? Whether that's a message of grace or hope or Jesus' love or whatever it may be. It is, to me, I think that we would all want to say we want our churches to be known for that grace. We want our churches to be known for that love. But if the community is only hearing questions, or I'm sorry, only seeing communications that say the next ice cream social is this, all is invited, but I mean, if you're not a part of the church, how likely are you to show up for an ice cream social? Because most of our events that we do, even though we invite everyone, for the majority, it's still insider, right? It's if you were to receive a birthday invitation at the local McDonald's for little Joey, and all are invited, are you really going to go? Maybe. Maybe you're craving chicken nuggets that day, I don't know. But when we think through communications, we need to think through that same mentality with our church as we would if we were sending an individual birthday invitation to people. Because the church is not the same church of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's not the place that everyone is clamoring to get into. So a broad invitation may not be the best communication that you can put out there. All right, next question. This is the most important question that you will ask. And that question is why? Why are you wanting to communicate this? Why is it important? Now, many times, without a communication plan or a strategy, we get caught up in that next event that's coming up. And so it becomes super, super important that we get the word out that everyone in the community is invited to the ice cream social. Even though, in the back of our minds, we know maybe one person shows up, but they're probably not showing up because of the communication I sent out. They're probably showing up because Miss Jones or Mr. Smith invited them to come with them. And so sometimes we can not waste our time, but we can direct our time toward the wrong type of communication. We could be communicating something that is really important about grace or about love or about something else, but instead we're caught up in doing things that we have always been told we should do. So why? Anytime you should be asking the question, when you're talking about communication, ask the question, why am I doing this? Defining your why is the key to answering your what. If you don't know why you're doing it other than we've always done this before, it's really not helping that what question. That question that, remember, what is the question that defines who you are. So if you don't know the major overarching purpose of why you're doing it, then it's not really reaching your what. So I want to take just a brief moment away from communicating, and I want us to talk or think about mission. This is a leadership cohort, right? And what I want us to think about is what it is that we're focusing on within our church. Would you say that there is at least one person, maybe even yourself, within your church that wants the church to grow? So if I was to ask you your strategy, how you're going to, what you're going to do to help your church grow, what's some things that you've either thought of or you've heard of, especially coming from the congregation? This is what we need in order to make our church grow.
That's part of the problem. Our churches, they don't have any. They always talk about what they used to do.
Okay, great, perfect.
We had 35 youth back in the 70s.
Yep, okay.
You got to focus on what sets you apart.
Okay.
Something that's helping us is visibility.
Okay.
Getting out, doing things outside the walls that attract attention.
Good. What's some other things? What are some things that your congregation believes? You all are superior pastors again, and you've switched my question a little bit, and you're actually getting ahead of me. Shame on you. Good job. What are some things, what are some typical answers that in churches that you've been at where people, this is what they think they need in order for churches to grow? Children.
Have good worship.
Good worship. Music. A young pastor. A guitar. At first I thought you said to get taller. And I was like, wow, I've not heard that one before. Those are the pretty common and typical answers, aren't they? A lot of times it's we need a younger pastor and we need children. The problem with that is they're not willing to follow the vision of a younger pastor, and they're certainly not willing to change the way their worship is in order to adapt for younger families and children. Now, an issue that a lot of our churches have is they see these grand mega churches. And when you see these grand mega churches, they're always advertising what? Young people and children. And you're always hearing about that. And there's nothing wrong with churches having young people and children. I'm not a big fan of mega churches, but I'm not going to say there's anything wrong with mega churches, but just not my cup of tea. But God has given each one of you a gift and has given your church, that church, His church, God's church, a gift in order to reach the community around you. But sometimes we don't think about that, and sometimes we don't focus on that. But friends, I'm bringing all this up because if we could ever latch on to whatever that is, then that becomes our what. And our why is easily defined because we want people to understand the love of God, and we're helping them do this through our what. And so if you're a church that has a great children's ministry, you want to communicate that, and you want people to know. But if you're not a church that has a strong, good, any children's ministry, you don't want to put that on your website. The last thing you need is to have this cool, hip, modern website with all this diversity, with age diversity, race diversity, with children located everywhere, and then I show up as a guest to your church and I see 6 white-haired people all in wheelchairs and on walkers. There's nothing wrong with those 6 people, but what you communicated was something that you're not. And that is a lot of times where our churches get hurt in their growth model, is because they want to be something that they're not, they communicate something that they're not, and their focus is on something that they should not be focusing on whatsoever. Yes, sir, Robert.
Trying to think about the why, because most of our congregations, they were starting with that why, but does the why changes, or does it need to be modified to, because I'm trying to figure out this why, let's say Renault started here, what was the why from the get-go? As it is supposed to change, and because the people who started the church, they thought this is how it's supposed to look like, it's supposed to face like this and stuff like that. That was like 100 years ago, but we are still on the same model. How can we try to change something which is already expired or out of date?
Well, let me just throw out an idea. I'm not sure that a lot of churches that were founded when Reynolds was or when Abingdon was ever asked why, because they never needed to.
Sure.
They grew up in that time when all you had to do was build a church, open the doors, put out your sign, people will come.
Right.
So you didn't really have to say what makes us distinctive, how are we going to engage with the community, what is our particular form of why do we exist? And you didn't have to ask that question. I think you did.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert, I would also say, when you ask the question, will your why change? I think so. I think one of the things that we have to look at is our community. Has our community changed in one way or another? Has the demographics changed? Because at one point, if your demographics was all older demographics, eventually it's either going to change with an influx of people or it's going to die and be gone. Either one of those happens and your why changes. And I think culturally helps change the why. We don't want to dwell on politics, but politics changes the why. There are several external factors within the ministry of the church that can affect the ministry of the church. So yeah, I think it's okay for the why to change. And the good thing, most of the time, why doesn't change very quickly. But in an instant in Turkey, the why changed like that. In a semi-instant in 2020, the why changed for us. The why is also being changed and being shaped by whatever decisions get made in upcoming general conferences. Decisions that get made in annual conferences, in districts, in cooperative parishes. You know, those types of things, when leadership changes, when prominent people within the church, if they leave or they pass away, those can all affect the whys of a church. Does that make sense?
And I think we all share a common why of drawing people into the love of God. But then beyond that, there are probably some smaller whys or some more contextual whys that are specific to our context, the church that you are pastoring in. And so we share a common why, and then as you start to look more at your ministry and the ministry of your community, you can start to contextualize that a
I would also argue that the fundamental why is there, and it should be our collective why. But there are churches that's not the fundamental makeup of the church as much as we would want it to be. Because if it was, I think our culture would look entirely different than what it does now. One of the things that we're working in, I serve on the invitation team with Ray and Scott, and we've been talking about, the bishop has an initiative concerning discipleship, and she wants us to be more involved in discipleship. And our mission statement in the United Methodist Church is really the Great Commission, and that's to go out and to make disciples. But how do we define discipleship? And I think that has changed over the course of time. Discipleship in the beginning was following Jesus, looking like Jesus, being like Jesus. Discipleship today doesn't really look like that anymore. There are some, and praise be to God that there are some, but even within our clergy, are we following Jesus? Do we look like Jesus? Are we mentoring like Jesus? Are we asking people to imitate the things we do like Jesus did? Or are we asking people to join a Bible study because that's what discipleship is for so many of us now in the Methodist Church? This particular slide was kind of referencing every bit of that. What is your why? And the different questions you can think of is the mission or the vision of your church, the community, and all of these things shape it, and there could be other things as well. All right. So the most important question that you will ask in any communication is, to whom are you communicating this to? And the reason this becomes an important question is because not every communication is going to hit every person. You may communicate by email, but as an 8-year-old, I'm not going to get that. You may communicate by TikTok, in which the entire world is going to, no, I'm just kidding. But when you start thinking about your audience, you begin to reshape potentially how you do your communication. For some people in your church, all you need to do is send them a date and a time. For some people, you need to define what it is. For some people, you need to email it, social media. You need to say it from the pulpit 26 times. You need to call them. You need to text them. And then you need to answer the question, why didn't you ever tell me about whatever it is? So the who helps you define how you're going to create your communication and how you're going to get that information out. Other questions to think about in your communication is, who is the actual audience? Is the audience an internal audience? Does it need to be separated by age? Is it an external audience? Because you may talk differently. As much as we like to say we don't want to be a church that uses internal language, we all use internal language. And you do that because of relationships that you have built. Inside communication is nearly, if not impossible, to get completely away from. However, that doesn't mean that you don't have two different communications. One that focuses internally, one that focuses externally.
I'd like to speak to that.
Yeah.
At Byers, I'll use this as a prime example. So we have grown by 15 to 20 attendants, ranging from 70s to teens. So we've picked up that whole demographic.
Wow.
Now, out of the 15 to 20, I'd say 75% of them are under 50. Now, that's a big deal in the United Methodist.
Absolutely it is.
But see, I have teenage daughters. I'm a Gen Xer myself. So I've put it in the bulletin or put it on the website, I'll check. We don't do email blasts, because half of them say, I don't have email. We do text, we call, so I pick up every one of those demographics, and it's helped. It's a lot of work, but
Yeah.
it's helped to reach everyone. So I think that when you're talking about communications, I feel like you can't just focus on one. If you're wanting to spread out your demographic of who you want to reach. So I vary from everything from TikTok to just putting it in a bulletin.
Yeah.
But it's managed to work, and the beauty of it is that you think it's just in the community that it grows. We have people coming that aren't part of the community. We have people that come to the youth group that live in Bluff City. We're in Glade Springs, Virginia. We have people that come that live in Bristol. We have people that come from everywhere. And I really believe that social media has helped, because it helps those that understand social media feel comfortable to say, okay, I understand that part of it. But then you also don't go so modern that you don't, that you bother the older crowd. So you've got both. And I by no means mastered it, but I can see that it works.
Yeah. We're really in a unique business model, because if you look at any other business models, they typically have their target demographics that they're going after. My wife and I have started watching Game Show Network, and we found out very quickly the Game Show Network, the people that watch that are much older than we are. And we know that because from the hours of 6:30 if we have it on, until about 8, it's products and things that I hope I never have to use. From 8:01 until we go to bed, it's a totally different demographic that's watching. It's really fascinating for you to go on and go to different channels and just watch the commercials, because if anyone understands communications and demographics, it's TV, because what is the number one export from the United States? It's entertainment. We're the king, we're the queen of entertainment. So, we're in a very unique situation, because we have cradle to grave that we are ministering to and wanting to get information out to. And so to be effective, we have to figure things out. And for those that are looking to bump up children's ministry or youth ministry, I challenge you to send something to the children or the youth, and communicate. Don't try to be hip and cool with the youth, but communicate directly to them and see what that does. It changes the perspective of everyone, especially if you send a card or a letter or something to little Susie, and mom has to read that letter to little Susie, and you're saying your dress was beautiful, or I loved how you whatever. That's a communication that goes a long way with a parent, as well as with the child. All right. So when is the most important question? There we go. We're starting to pick up on this. Is the most important question that you ask when it comes to your communications. And this is where your strategy comes in, your plan comes in. When are you going to start the communication? And it's different for each area. When Bishop Wallace Paget first got here, and she sat down with me and we were talking about our communication strategy, she said, now typically I like to start advertising 6 months in advance. That's exactly what I did, David. I said, welcome to Holston. They're not going to read it until 6 minutes before the event starts. So we compromised, and we started looking at kind of a 3 month to 2.5 month strategy, and that has worked better for Holston. It's still, most of the time, if it's an annual event and people start getting information too early, I can look at my email statistics, and I can see people aren't even opening it. But as we get closer to an annual event, then they start reading about what's coming up or who's going to be there or what have you. So you have to find your context in your church. What is it that people really need, and what will they tolerate as well? This isn't a question that you can just make up on your own and say, well, they only need it the day before, just so you can be lazy about it. But it is exegeting your congregation when it comes to your communication schedule. Same thing with how often. Can you over-communicate? Absolutely, you can. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But how often becomes important because, and do I need a plan? Because then once you start exegeting and learning your congregation, you will find out that they're going to read my emails the most on Tuesday at 7:30. One thing that I discovered after Bishop Wallace Paget came that did not exist in Holston before is my best email open rate now is Friday afternoons, which blew my mind because we have so many clergy that take off on Fridays. In the past, if I sent something on Friday, it was dead in the water. It might get opened Monday or Tuesday, but more than likely it got deleted somewhere in that 3-day period. But now that has changed. So exegete and find out what works best. You can also do that in your social media post. You can find out when the likes are taking place and start timing your social media post. And every one of your social medias that you have, you can time. You can put the post together and schedule it to go out on Wednesday at 10:15 or 10:17 or whatever it may be. But those are things to think about. Yeah, Lisa?
I didn't know you could, okay, with like Gmail, can you tell when your emails are being opened?
See, we've got email platforms, and we'll talk about that, but there are platforms, and there's free platforms, and we'll give you some resources that keep those statistics for you. I don't think, does Google Analytics follow Gmail? Okay, I didn't think so. But there are some tools out there that you can use that will help you with that. When we talk, this is a really important thing. You need to communicate in the amount the person receiving it needs in order for them to use the information. Because again, the more you communicate, and especially if you're communicating the same thing, then people will ignore it. And so often, and sometimes I get in a rush and I do the same thing. I may send the exact same email blast out, and that's not a good idea. It's a better idea to rewrite and redo it, because the third time that I send something out, I may have new information, but they've already seen the same thing twice, and they may ignore it because they've seen the same thing twice. So you've got to figure out, and again, each audience may be a little bit different as far as how you're communicating with them. All right. Last question to think about is how. And how, guess what? It's the most important question. And I'm going to turn this over to Ben, and he's going to come up and he'll talk about the different areas, internal and external, and some channels that you all can use.
All right. I think we can switch over to the second presentation. And we will try to talk about, Tim said it, internal communication, external communication, and then start to look at what channels of communication we have available to us. And then we will break for lunch. So let's give it just a minute and get our presentation up. So if we had to, uh-oh, not quite. All right, internal versus external communication. What would you imagine we mean when we talk about internal communication? Announcements. Sure. What else? Internal communication. The bulletin. Email. Volunteer list. Okay. What about external communication? What does that entail? Phone tree. I heard something else. Email. Sure. Facebook. Sure. Social media. Yeah. How are we doing on our presentation? Getting there? So internal communication, I would say our goal with internal communication is to foster and grow engagement. To foster and grow engagement. And to do that, our audience, the people whom we're trying to communicate with when we're talking about internal communication, are the people who are already invested in our church. So we might say those are the people who have a reason to pay attention to what we're saying. So some examples, and you all were spot on. I think church updates, recruitment, community building, and then one that I didn't hear from any of you all, but I think is vital when we think about all of the ways that we communicate with our internal audience is spiritual growth, right? In communicating with your internal audience, that would be with your congregants, spiritual growth is a huge part of what you're communicating to those people. Comparatively, external communication, I think our goal is to engage the community and create new relationships. So when we're talking about external communication, this really looks like communicating with those people who may not be connected to our church. So we might say visitors or the community, outside individuals, or the unchurched. That's a in the know kind of term there. Some examples here would be resource offering, things that our church provides to the community as services to individuals. Invitations or event promotion. This is a more traditional idea of what external communication might be, marketing for an event that we're hosting, right? And then advertising. So the question to ask, I think, when you are thinking about a message that you want to communicate, is the message you're sending targeting internal or external audiences? Anytime you're trying to or working towards communicating a message, this is a vital question. Tim went down the list. This is the most important question to ask, because the way you communicate changes drastically if you're talking to internal audiences or external audiences. If you think about, in this room, some of you I know, not very well, but some of you I know, Tim, for instance, I know very well. I'm going to communicate differently with Tim than I do with you all, because I have a much different relationship with him than I do with you all. Even more so, I'm going to communicate a lot differently to my mother, than I do to someone who I don't know at all. The way you communicate changes based on the relationship you have with the person you're trying to communicate. And so even if I want to communicate to both internal and external audiences, I still need to think about how I'm communicating with them, because I need to do it differently for both sets of audiences, right? So we start to look at what are the ways that we have to communicate. What ways do you have to communicate with your internal and external audiences? So we've been talking about them. We've been naming some of them. Let's make a list of all the different channels of communication that we have. What do we have? Announcements. Bulletin. Email. Text message. Signage. So a couple of those, bulletin, signage, I would just kind of lump those as print media, right? Email, texting, social media. We talked about phone calls, phone tree, your website, right? If you have a website. Speaking from the pulpit, right? As a pastor, your pastoral communication, that's a channel. And then I would add one more, interpersonal communication. So working with your members, with your congregants, to communicate the old-fashioned way, right? Person to person. So these are, I think, the 7 big channels. If you're thinking about a communication strategy, a structure to think through how you're going to communicate, I think these are 7 vital channels that everyone should consider. Some of them may not work in your context, may not be effective, available in your context, but I would say if you're not going to use one of these, you should have a reason why you're not. So maybe texting, plenty of churches don't use texting, and that's okay. Maybe you don't need to do that, but consider it. Think it through, because I think these 7 can be pretty important. So I want to run through each of these and note some of the defining characteristics or the strengths of each of these. So first, email. This is a huge one, and we're going to have a whole section after lunch about how you can use email most effectively. One of the biggest things about email is it's direct to the recipient. So you get to choose who you send it to. And there's a lot that's really powerful, and a lot of people take that for granted. That means I know I'm sending it to you. I know I'm sending it to you. Whether you open it or not, that's up to you, but I know I sent it. But I can also say, I know I sent it to just you. Not, I put it out there so everyone has access to it, but I know I sent it to just this group of people. Not that I'm excluding someone else, but maybe it doesn't matter to that group of people, right? But I can be more selective with email. You're able to communicate more information than, say, social media, right? If you put something out on social media, there's a pressure to keep it succinct, to keep it short. People don't pull up a picture on Instagram and spend 5 minutes reading the caption of the Instagram. That's just not the medium, right? But email, they more often will. They'll give you more time. It's also measurable. We mentioned this a minute ago, and Tim will go more into this. But there are some tools where you get to see how many people opened your email. Or at the very least, even if you're using Gmail, you know how many people you sent it to, right? Next, phone, calling, or text. There we go. So again, you know exactly who you're sending it to. It can be more personal if you text or if you call, right? If someone texts you or gives you a ring on the phone, you may be more likely to engage with them than if they post something on Facebook, right? It has a personal touch. But it can be time-consuming if you're going to call every person in your church, and it's much harder to scale. The larger your congregation is, the more people you want to communicate, the longer that takes. Or in some instances, the more expensive that is. Next is print. So this includes your signage, your bulletin, your flyers, anything you do, both in your church or if you do any kind of print media outside of your church, it has more staying power. So what I mean by that is, compared to maybe posting something on Facebook, once someone sees it once, they're probably not going to see it again. It won't show up on their feed again. But something that's printed, especially if it's posted on the bulletin board or on a magnet on their fridge, they're going to see it for a while, and it's going to stay top of mind, or at least present in the mind. It can be costly, right? The more you print, the more it costs. And once it's printed and distributed, you kind of give up control, right? So if you make a mistake, and you'll see, I made a printout for you today that we'll get to after lunch. I did indeed make a mistake, and now I can't fix it because it's already printed. But so you need to change a time or a date of an event, or for whatever reason you need to change something, right? Print media is more static in that way. Social media, it's wide-reaching, right? It can go out, you can reach the other side of the world with social media. It's interactive. This is the biggest defining characteristic of social media, is that it engages other people, right? It draws them in. Not only are they viewing your content or even responding to you, but they are part of that communication. Once you start a conversation on Facebook, the viewer's experience with that communication is affected by the conversation of others. It becomes part of the experience of that communication. And finally, it's dynamic. It's always changing, both in the content that you put out and also in the way that we do it. Facebook, the best practices of Facebook or of Instagram or of TikTok, the best practices change every month, right? Which can be daunting, but also exciting. There's so much you can do with social media. Your website. You may have heard this before, it's the front door to your ministry. So if someone is curious about your church, the website is in many cases going to be the first thing they go to search out information about your church. It has a higher position of authority than social media, perhaps. If it's on their website, they must really mean it, right? Or it shows they put a little more thought into it before they shared it, because what's on your website is a little bit more permanent. You can change it. It's dynamic, but not to the same degree that social media is, right? There's a certain level of importance that's placed on content that's on your website. But here's the downside. It requires your audience to initiate, right? They have to go to your website for them to see your website. Versus other forms, email, you send it to them. You get to put it in front of their face. Your website is not the same way. From the pulpit, we often forget about this one when we're thinking about communication as a task that we have to do. Oftentimes, communication is separate from your job as a preacher. But it's perhaps your most powerful means of communication. You have a captive audience, right? If they choose to come and sit in the pew or in the chair, you get a solid 20 to however long you want, really. And they have to listen to you. They can fall asleep, I guess. Maybe they do. But more than any other means of communication, you have a captive audience here. You are also at your highest position of authority when you are preaching to your congregation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that might mean. But when you're speaking from the pulpit, or really as a pastor, when you are speaking directly to anyone, whether they're a member or not, that carries a higher level of authority than if your church was to send an email, right? Here's our downside. It's limited to the people who come to hear you preach. So you can only communicate from the pulpit to those who choose to listen to you in the pulpit. Finally, interpersonal. This includes any kind of, maybe we're looking at like traditional evangelism. So sending your people out into the community to create new relationships, to bring people in. Any kind of person-to-person interaction, that falls here under interpersonal. It's more personal, just like a phone call, calling out someone directly. It shows that I care a little bit more than if I was to send an email to you. But it requires a higher level of involvement. So we have all of these 7. Are there any other channels of communication that you, in your church, in your context, have available to you? Yeah? Podcast. I love it. Do you have a podcast? Fantastic. Okay. Is it a podcast of your church or of you?
It's myself and the director of ministries. We've been doing a series on, we did kind of the history of why we're at the split, then we did questions from the congregation on the split. Now we're spending time focusing on what unites us, what we're better together than we are separate, and why it's better to stay together than to split apart.
Awesome.
And we direct people to this. Like, well, I have a question about. Okay, I'm happy to talk to you. Go to the podcast where we just talk about it. So that's one thing that we have available.
Yeah. What would you say are the benefits of podcast as a channel of communication or as a platform?
People can listen. They can go back and hear what was said again. You talk to somebody, but then you can also refer into another conversation. So it's kind of like, if I have a conversation with somebody and say, well, we talked about it in the podcast, that they can hear the consistency that's given instead of, well, the podcast said one thing and then you said something else.
Yeah.
There's an expectation that you're going to take a little deeper dive and spend some time.
Yeah, definitely.
And we do. We do. I mean, if you ask me a question about what I think about X, I'll tell you and say. But in the podcast, it's a safe environment. The director of ministries and he and I are just kind of talking through some things. We're going back and forth with it, so we're kind of an old tired phrase. We're peeling back the onion more.
Yeah, definitely. What would you say is unique about the audience that you're able to reach with a podcast?
They're technologically savvy.
Okay.
To some degree. Because you have to be able to find it and click on it and know what you're doing with it. And probably they're more curious and interested. It's like if I just want to answer a question, I'll ask Glenn a question. If I want to really know something, a deeper dive, I might ask Glenn a question, then I'll go to a podcast, then I'll look at a book, then I'll go to a website. If I want something deeper than just a conversation.
I would say that shows a higher level of investment from your audience, right? What would you say, what are you able to communicate using a podcast that you may not be able to communicate with other channels of communication?
I do think that in the way that we do the podcast, it's more of we do it very conversationally, so we're able to communicate more of hey, we're having a conversation. We're having a dialogue. So you're able to basically eavesdrop on that, because obviously if you're listening to the podcast, you can't interact with the podcast directly. So able to communicate that and able to share more personal view, more of myself as pastor in that conversation.
Yeah. I love listening to podcasts. Our office is in Alcoa, and I live in Knoxville, so it's about a 30 to 40-minute drive there and back, or one way. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. One of the things that I value most about podcasts, I think, is it often allows discussion on more nuanced topics that otherwise would not, they wouldn't come across so well. we're going to talk about some of the pitfalls of social media. One of them is talking about nuanced conversations on social media can be dangerous, right? A podcast may be a better platform to talk about some of the hot topics, right? Because you get more time to fully explain yourself, and maybe to hear diverse opinions or to bring in different context, right?
Well, even in the podcast, it's like, the director of ministries and, we talk about it. And even in the conversation, something that comes up and say, well, what about this? And I'll say, well, that could lead to this impression. Now, what I mean by that is,
Yeah.
you have a chance to, like you just said, explain yourself a little more and kind of take into account. Like if I was sitting across the table talking to somebody, I would make an effort to be nuanced
Mm-hmm.
and appreciate that fact and especially if I read the body language. Like if I said something, you're like, I'll say, well, what I mean by that is,
Yeah.
in an effort to explain myself. So it's kind of anticipating that. Sometimes in the back and forth with the director of ministries, he might look at me like, what? Or I might look at him like, what did you say?
Mm-hmm.
So then we pick up on that on each other, and then so it creates the conversation that creates the content of the podcast.
Yeah.
It does allow for back and forth, but it's in a controlled environment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
If you're just, somebody walks in your office and they say, well, I want to talk about, choose your topic. The questions that they ask or the statements that they make may get you a little bit off your game.
that's true. Because there's prep and planning to the podcast. I mean, I know what we're talking about. We're not going to go off topic. There's not an interruption. And if something happens, well, he will go back and edit it. So, it seems very, this was a good conversation. How do you do that in a row? Well, it's called editing.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I'm building a communications strategy or a plan, and I have all of these different channels of communications, adding podcast in gives me a whole new way that I can communicate with my audiences. Maybe it gives me a whole new category of conversations or of messages that I wouldn't otherwise be able to communicate effectively. Are there any other channels that come to mind that you could add to your own communications plan?
Internal or external?
Either one.
Okay, one external one is connecting with events or groups that reflect your values.
Say more.
Okay. Like let's say that in Abington, there's Men and Women, and it's a recovery program. If you partner with them and get your name attached as a sponsor, then that's a way to signal to the wider community that that's a point where you have interest, that reflects your values, and it just, it's in a way to advertise, but it's also a way to show where your heart is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's interesting. That probably to me that shows that maybe gets into branding, church branding. It's creating your identity as a church. I would say that may be separate from how I'm looking at channels, because what I'm looking for are ways that if I have a message, and we're about to get to this, I'm jumping ahead, but if I have a message and I'm trying to decide how to communicate that message, what I'm looking for here are what are the different ways that I can communicate that message at any time. If I'm going about my ministry, I want to communicate this specific thing, what are my options? What are the different ways that I can communicate? I could see maybe reaching out or having partnerships with organizations or businesses or anyone, and using them to help distribute your message.
Okay. But let me just, here's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
There was a public event to promote this new ministry in the community. It was basically a fundraiser. They And that name was up there. So to me, that was one way to, as United Methodists, indicate that that's where we're interested in. And if you are value-driven, that, it just seems to me if you're
Yeah.
value-driven, then that's going to connect. That's
Mm-hmm. So in that instance, what would you say the message that you were that you were communicating by having your sponsorship there?
that we are interested in, that we're interested in the health of the community. We're interested in reaching out to marginalized people. That we are, that we're concerned with people that other people don't always care about.
I love that. So that's new. I'd never thought about this before. So your message there, we'll just run a little case study here. Your message was, we care about marginalized people in our community. And the channel you used to communicate that message was sponsorship. I like that. I'd never thought about that before. Anyone else? Any other channels that come to mind? Paid and unpaid media. So, like what?
Well, Caroline, for example, has been in the media a lot over the past 2-3 years, and every time she is featured, she's telling the story of Proverbs 3:27 ministry, or telling the story of how God was with her through COVID and communicating a message, and that was free. And then paid, obviously, is paid advertising.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going, piggyback off of that, we're getting ready to, sorry, I'll turn it down. We're getting ready to sponsor either a team or a sign at the Little League field.
Mm-hmm.
While that is advertisement, that lets the community know that, hey, Byers Cobbs cares about our kids, because they're putting this out. It's not for advertisement. That's why we're leaning maybe towards sponsoring a team and uniforms, because that lets the kids know, hey, they care enough about us to make sure we get uniforms.
Mm.
We have a team now. So that's in the paid aspect of it. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody thinks it's always about, well, you sponsored a sign, you're just wanting to get your name out. Well, no, that $450 helps these kids get uniforms, or
Yep.
helps these kids get supplies. So it's not always about getting your name, it's about showing the community that you care enough that you're willing to invest in it.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people they think that it's always self-promotion. It's not. There's a background to it.
Yeah.
And I think as churches, that we get the misnomer that we're just trying to put our name out there, when it's more about caring, because it lets you know in the flyer that this is what this is going for. So I think in that aspect, I think we do get a bad name sometimes for things like that when we're actually just trying to help out and care.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we added maybe sponsorship or some version of that, using the resources you have to communicate your message. And then we could add media relations, so that might involve your local news or your local paper as another channel of communication. So here are our 7.
The only other thing that, and you kind of cover it between website and social and things, but one used to be popular medium would be blog or a blog.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So we have our 7 channels here. And what I want to start doing is we did a couple case studies, right? We walked through it. But when we identify a message that we want to communicate, then we can start to choose which channels we use and how we use those channels to communicate that message. So of these 7, the generic 7 that I chose, which of these can we use for internal communication? Email, sure. Print. Phone. Social media.
Pretty much all of them, except the website seems to
Yeah. It may not be focused on your internal audience. In some instances, some churches have a section of their website specifically for members, and then maybe the main page, the first stop on their website is definitely still externally focused. Yeah, I think all of these we can use for internal communication. What about external communication?
So you just said the website. I mean, that
Sure.
people don't look at the phone book anymore to find a church.
What?
People don't look at the phone book anymore. What is? Well, they keep setting one out the end of the driveway. You expect me to pick it up, yeah. And I pick it up and go, yeah, let's just go recycling.
Well, the same thing as numbers and 50 pages of that.
I mean, people that I've talked to in Marion and people at the church, they go, well, yeah, we Google, and if you
Mm-hmm.
have a website that is engaging and up to date, they want to come visit. They're open to.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's vital.
Static and not updated, that's dead.
Yeah.
I've learned that if somebody hears about the church, the first thing our generation does, or today's generation, is to see if they Google it, to see if it has a website, they go to the website and they look at the website.
Yeah.
That's the first thing, or Facebook. But that's the first thing so those are, well, I think all of those work with pulpit for external. Pulpit doesn't work for external.
Right.
But I think
Go ahead.
Glenn's disagreeing.
Uh-huh.
You want to talk to or there to hear you? The people you want to talk to are there to hear you. Say, well, pulpit is for external.
Right.
Okay, well, the reason that I reacted is because we found that when somebody hears about the church, you're right, first place they go to is the website. But then the second thing they do is they will watch a worship service online before they will show up.
Aha.
So I apologize. On our website, I post audio each week.
Yeah.
Website, YouTube, Facebook.
I'm sorry, sir. I did not mean
Shows how ministry and communication.
There you go. Well, I'll tell you, I also said pulpit maybe wasn't.
Well, I'm just saying we don't always realize how far we may be reaching.
I stand corrected.
Well, I was there with you. I also said maybe not pulpit. I said maybe not phone or text. I suppose you could. I don't get a phone book at my house. I haven't gotten a phone book in I don't know, a long time. I'm not sure, but I guess you could start cold calling people to invite them to your church. That doesn't seem like a super effective means of communication in my context. Perhaps it is for yours. But I would say probably phone is not a super great means of communications for external. Sure, yeah. Definitely.
And the other thing is, when you post all this stuff, especially after COVID, we all went to Facebook and all social media. But now you hear parishioners who love coming in passion to worship, they are now fighting that. Because they're saying, we have made people lazy watching us on TV because they want people to come into a place of worship. So I think you said we're going to talk about all the negative side of all this, and I think that's one. I'm dealing with some people who are like, yeah, let's shut down the Facebook so that people will come back.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly.
It's like the post office. The post office continually loses money. And their business model is, hey, let's raise postage rates. Thinking that's going to somehow make me mail more because it costs more to mail. No, it just makes me more inclined less to do more online where I have to use no postage.
Yep.
So if we go, well,
Mm-hmm.
They weren't coming back to begin with. Shutting off the means by which they were connected is not going to somehow all of a sudden go, well, now that I've been shut off online, I need to go in person. So we have a lady at church, and I've talked to her many times. Went and visited her. I said, we want you to come to church. She said, I ain't getting out of my pajamas. And she says, I'm going to watch you online. But every month she sends her tithe check in. But she plainly tells you up front, I have become comfortable. She's on the elderly side. She doesn't want to come out and get sick.
Mm-hmm.
She still mails her tithes in. So if I shut that down, then, and it's not about money, but if you shut that down, she will find somewhere else to go and watch.
Mm-hmm.
And she's liable to send her tithe to that church.
Sure.
I have a viewer in Minnesota.
I mean,
Did you find him? No, they're checking. He's from AWOL, but.
I heard the strangest thing a couple of months ago that kind of ties in with what you're talking about. There's a woman, this was a church in North Carolina who had a regular viewer in Oregon. This is an older woman, she's single, she's not connected with a church. She considered that church in North Carolina to be her home church. She sends money every month, but when she died, her family reached out to that church to help them in grief care.
Mm.
Wow.
That's powerful.
This is another thing, and I was wondering whether presence, just being there, you're not saying anything. I'm bringing this because one time we were talking with Brother Scott about the international ministry to Kenya, and I was like, maybe next time the people who are going there, we need people who can speak, people who can teach, people who can preach and evangelize. But Brother Scott told me, I don't think it's a good idea, but also we need the presence, just people who are going there. They may not say anything, but they are going to communicate aloud just by their presence that we love you guys. We may not be able to speak your language, but being here, we are all together.
Mm.
And I was like, whoa, that's so powerful, that's so true. Because the first group we took there, not everybody said anything, but we know the impact which, as we left, I hear people asking me, how about so and so? Those kind of questions. So I think also the presence, just being there.
Yeah.
Because like over here in Bristol, we have been having the issue of city thinking because of the dam. And every time here at the city hall, there are people who have been going there just to stand there. They may not have a word, but they are saying they are standing there to let the city hall know we are not very happy with what is happening. And just the other day, they are doing something regarding the smell in our city. And it's because of the people's presence and people just get it.
I would rather know I'm loved than you can tell me.
Mm.
I can tell you I love you all day long, but if I don't show you I love you,
Mm-hmm.
that's what you're talking about. Just by showing up and being there, those people knew that they were loved.
Yeah.
And I think that's more important than anything.
Yeah. I think just as important as familiarizing ourselves with some of these standard channels of communication is getting used to using this process, this way of thinking, to think about how we're communicating our message. Because sometimes, in many instances, the message we want to communicate is best communicated by our presence somewhere, or by the money that we donate to buy jerseys for a team, right? That, I would say those are non-traditional forms of communication, but we're talking about them. they're communicating our message. And so those are equally as important as some of these. So maybe the takeaway here is not just here are some ways that you can communicate, but here's the way you can start thinking about communication and structuring your message, being more strategic about choosing how you communicate.
And I want to add something real quick before you move here, because something struck me in this last conversation. And this is a plug for Bishop again and her call for discipleship. But one thing I've never thought of or looked at is using discipleship as a channel of communication. And Robert, it's one thing for you as the pastor to ask your online people to come and be present, physically present, but it means a whole heck of a lot more when the people that they've grown up with and the people that they've been in community with for a longer portion of their life was to ask. And so through that discipleship, if we use that interpersonal channel and teach others to share and communicate that message, it's only multiplying the good news that we're trying to share.
So I think that's the most powerful thing, that when you have a collective mission, and our Kenya mission has really spawned that for us in a sense. It's one thing for myself, for Robert, Caroline, or John to mention it and promote it, but when the entire team takes ownership of that, it's a whole other platform of communication. It's ownership, it's ministry, you fill in the blank, but it really resonates a collective message that others say, hey, I'm interested, or maybe I want to be a part of that. That's vital. To make that jump is sometimes very hard.
But I think it is something that you can build into your structure, right? You can plan for it.
Yeah. And you want to encourage it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's something that if you know that you have that tool in your tool bag, that's one that you can pull out and rely on when you have something that you really need to communicate, right? So this is just about identifying and collecting your tools. What tools, what channels do you have available? And so we're going to take a break soon for lunch. We're almost there. But I think the question then is, how do you choose which channel to use when you want to communicate a message? So we've kind of identified our audiences, or that's a process that you can start to do at your church. It looks different for every church. We've identified some of our channels, and again, that's something that you can contextualize to your church, because there will be some, like we've discussed, that are specific to your church. Now, the process becomes how do we line up our message to the proper or the most effective channels to communicate that message. So first, we define our message. What is it that we're trying to communicate? We identify who it is that we're really trying to communicate to. And this is vital. This is where we get into the internal versus external. But more than that, this is when we look at maybe some demographics, some age groups, location, right? Whether they are active attenders of your church or semi-active attenders of your church. If they're a younger crowd that might be more engaged on social media, or an older crowd that might more appreciate a bulletin insert, right? And then from there, we choose our channel. If we walk through this process, every time we need to communicate a message, big picture or small picture, this could be the meeting is changed from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Or it could be Reynolds is a church that loves God and loves people. Those are both messages that we want to communicate, and we can run through the same process for both of those things. One matters more than the other, and one is more long-term, right? The process looks different, but the steps are the same. We define our message. We really look at what it is that we're trying to communicate. We identify who we're trying to communicate that to. Maybe it's something that is important enough that we really are communicating it to as many people as possible. So if the answer is everyone, I think that's not good enough for this section, because we still need to break that down into what are the different groups of people, because we communicate to different audiences differently. We touched on that, right? We were already there. So even if your message is going out to a broad audience, we still need to do the work of identifying who those people are, because we're going to, in the next step, choosing our channels, we're going to do that based off of the different groups that we're communicating to. And then finally, we've already compiled a list of channels, that tool bag of tools that we can use, and now we're just matching. We have list A and list B, and we're saying this is a good way to communicate to this group, this is a good way to communicate to this group. And when we have those lined up, then we start to see how we can effectively communicate specifically to the people whom we want to communicate to. So, I was going to run through a couple kind of case studies, but we did that. And we're actually at the time that we were hoping to take lunch. So we're going to take a break, and I think we have lunch available back there. I do have a few questions for you all to talk about during lunch. So while we're eating, here's 3 questions. How are you most effectively communicating to your internal audiences? So maybe look back at or think back on some of the channels that we discussed. Which of those has been most effective for you in communicating with some internal audiences that you have? Then what is the most effective way that you're communicating with your external audiences? What works for you? What works in your context? And third, what channels What channels do you need to lean more on to improve your church? What are some areas of weakness? How can you improve in some of these areas? More than answering these specific questions, I hope that you all in discussion start to just walk through that process. So here, define, identify, choose your channels. How does that process look in your context? In many cases, how are you already doing this without really thinking about it? And then how can you improve? What are some channels, some ways that you can improve on that? So I'll leave these questions up, and we'll take a break for maybe 45 minutes, and then we'll come back to it. Sounds good? Oh, absolutely.
I'm assuming we're ready to go, Theresa. You give us the green light, okay? So we're ready to go. We'll have a blessing. Okay. For those of you that, just so you know, most of us know where the facilities are. We have a restroom through this door in the hallway, one here, then 2 downstairs, right down at the bottom of the steps. So let's have a blessing. God, we thank you so much for a time that we can come together and learn and grow, but also, Lord, that we can have fellowship. We thank you for the wonderful food that's been placed before us, for the hands that have prepared it, and the means that we have obtained it. We ask now your blessings upon it, Lord, to strengthen our bodies and our witness, but also, God, that it would draw us closer to each other and closer to you. For this we pray in the name of Christ our Lord. Let the church say, amen.